Off-grid living for mere mortals, even if it's not quite legal.
Good evening and welcome to Offgrid Outlaw. Tonight, I want to talk about this age verification thing that's going around the internet and a little bit of history. Way back at the turn of the 20th century, when radio broadcasting was in its experimental infancy stages, the federal government soon realized that radio communication or mass communication presented a potential threat to its hegemony on power. So, as a result, what they did was form the Federal Radio Commission and regulate the airwaves. In other words, they claimed ownership over all the radio spectrum that was known at the time, and they made it off limits to the public, except to special entities that were able to afford a broadcast license. Flash forward to the 1990s, when there was a very large peak in the radio piracy movement, or the free speech, free radio movement, led by folks like Stephen Dunifer at UC Berkeley, people like Doug Brewer down in Florida. There was another fellow also in that general area in the same state. There were a lot of these unlicensed FM stations on the air, and the Federal Communications Commission was in a big game of whack-a-mole. They were having a hard time keeping up with all the pirates. And at the time, the chairman of the FCC was telling the radio pirates that now that the internet exists, remember this was back in the late 90s, they should do their broadcasting on the internet where they don't need a license. And their argument was that spectrum was scarce and it was a limited resource. So, back in the 1990s, when I heard that, I thought to myself, well, it won't be long. Eventually, the internet will require some kind of a license just to be able to use it. Flash forward to today, we see that the internet has become a major communications medium and a mass communications medium, where you have a single individual that can have a pulpit that has access to thousands, if not millions, of viewers through platforms like social media and various video hosting platforms. So I think what's happening now is that the government's worried about the people having too much of a voice and too much influence, just like they worried in the 1910s and 1920s when radio broadcasting was in its infancy. So what they're doing now is a game of swapping the cups with the rocks in them. You know, the game where you put a rock or a candy underneath a paper cup, and then you have another paper cup and you swap them around a few times, and then the person has to guess which cup the rock is under. Well, this is a kind of similar situation where they're trying to trick us with child safety as the motivation for some new legislation that will limit access to the internet, and they do it in stages. Right now, what they're doing is this age verification thing where certain social media platforms will not allow you to use them unless you provide a government issued ID. Now, I don't need to get into the ramifications of the dangers that presents. For example, for journalists working in communist countries where they need anonymity to avoid being executed by government agents there. The tone of this legislation has always been framed in the, oh, we have to protect the children aspect of things. However, collecting a whole bunch of photo IDs is just building a database of everybody, including underage children, which would be an absolute gold mine for the Epstein class. So in reality, they're telling you one thing, but it's having the opposite effect. And then, of course, I believe Reddit attempted this age verification thing late last year, and they were hacked, and 70,000 files with people's personal data got leaked. And now they want to do it again universally. They want to get all social media under this control. They're doing it in Europe, and now they're considering legislation in the United States for the same thing. And they'll do it in stages. They'll start with social media, then eventually it'll be other things. And then at some point, to access the internet or to even have an internet connection at all, the average user will be required to provide some sort of government ID, biometrics, a face scan, a fingerprint, some sort of data that will link that account to them inextricably. And that's a dangerous trend for obvious reasons. But the nice thing about the internet, as they always used to say, on the internet, no one knows you're a dog. But those days could be over very soon. The real issue that we're dealing with here is that a lot of people will not be able to access the internet if they don't want to go along with this violation of their personal privacy. And of course, there are things that we can do to put some resistance up. One, I think, would be effective if everyone decided to cancel their internet service contract. The internet service providers would be in a real tussle over what to do because they would be losing money rapidly. And seeing the writing on the wall, they would be inclined to lobby Congress to repeal these laws pronto. Because let's face it, internet service providers can't stay in business very long if they don't have any customers. So that's another issue. And it's a possible way that the consumer can fight back against this legislation. So I think the real issue here is that the government is worried about losing its hegemony on power, and seeing the rise of alternative media scares the bejesus out of them. So hence, this is their half-baked attempt at using subterfuge to say, oh, it's all for the children, and we got to do age identification on everybody. I don't think it's protecting anybody at all. I think it creates more security risks, as we found out with the Reddit leak. And can you imagine hundreds of millions of people with their driver's licenses, facial ID, fingerprints, whatever, all in a database, and that database gets hacked? And the sky is the limit as to what can happen with that data in terms of falling into the hands of bad operators. Well, anyway, that's my take on it. Government has always wanted to maintain a hegemony on power and the means of communications to influence masses of people. And I think the internet is now, 100 and some odd years later, now the new frontier, the new radio communications that must be regulated and eventually licensed. I think someday you'll eventually need some sort of license to be able to place content on the internet. Anyway, that's another one. That wraps up this edition of Offgrid Outlaw. Be happy, be healthy, live long. And I'll see you in the next one.